Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, we'll look at the economic forces at play in Germany as a new government takes shape. Also this week, weather catastrophes. Does climate change mean that some assets are now uninsurable? Plus, Ryanair's mess up, Europe's biggest discount airline, flies into trouble with pilots and passengers as it cancels thousands of flights. Germany today is the biggest economy in the Eurozone and its growth outlook remains strong. Ahead of the September 24th national election, survey showed Germans are satisfied with the state of their economy. However, analysts warn that cracks are beginning to appear. And if Angela Merkel is elected to a fourth term as German chancellor, she'll have to deal with them. More on those risks in just a moment. But first, here's Niamh Barker with a look back at Merkel's economic performance to date in steering Europe's engine of growth.
Angela Merkel made history when she became Germany's first female chancellor. 48 years earlier, with German cities still in ruins after the defeat of the Nazi regime, the country's first post-war chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, signed the Treaty of Rome that led to the creation of the European Union. European integration was designed to contain Germany's power. It would turn the country into the most powerful economy in Europe.
All chancellors following from the Second World War and continuing with Angela Merkel have had this trend where they want to protect German interests through the vehicle of the EU and focus on trade and also on kind of the democratic liberal principles that you see Merkel almost become the beacon of.
Germany's so-called economic miracle began under Chancellor Ludwig Erhard. He forged ties with the US as Soviet Russia tightened its grip on communist East Germany. Later chancellors Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt tried to improve ties with East Germany and the Soviet Union while supporting NATO and the European community. As the Cold War thawed, the Berlin Wall dividing West and East Germany fell. Merkel entered politics, later joining the Christian Democrats. She soon became Chancellor Helmut Kohl's protégé. A woman and former East German, she symbolised a new, united country. In 2005, she won a narrow victory over Gerhard Schröder, becoming Chancellor of a grand coalition. During her 12 years in office, Angela Merkel has drawn some key lessons from her predecessors. She's remained flexible. During the refugee crisis, her open-door policy has allowed the country to bolster its plummeting population. And in the same way that previous chancellors have tried to balance both Eastern and Western powers, so she has struggled to overcome rival political impulses within her own country. And abroad, she's played a pivotal role in balancing Western interests with those of Putin's Russia and increasingly confrontational Turkey under President Erdogan.
She inherited policy traditions, which she's maintained. Very pro-European policy and a sense that Germany should talk to both East and West and try to find a peaceful solution when possible.
One of her biggest achievements is in balancing Germany's national budget. But the austerity measures that benefited Europe's largest exporter have crippled others. For many Greeks, she's a symbol of a divided Europe. However, for those unnerved by Donald Trump's America First policy, she's seen as the last defender of liberal Western values. And together with her allies, she's waged war on Euroscepticism in the hope of reinvigorating belief in the EU, a union central to Germany's place in the world.
Well, there's no disputing Germany's economic success story. The country's central bank projects that this year's growth may be even stronger than the 1.9% posted last year. Unemployment is at a post-unification low of 5.7%, and the government's budget is in surplus. However, the income gap between the richest and poorest Germans is growing. There's a call for greater investment in things like education and infrastructure. Demographics, too, are a worry. Germany has the second oldest population in the world after Japan. Then there's the issue of Germany's place in the digital economy. Critics say that its lack of broadband infrastructure puts it in the slow lane. And the car manufacturing industry is still embroiled in the fallout from a massive international scandal, and the automotive industry itself is changing. Joining us now from London is Peter Dixon. Peter's a senior economist with Commerzbank in London. Peter, great to have you with us on the programme. So, Germany today, the biggest economy in the Eurozone. Its economic outlook still strong. However, the income gap between the richest and poorest Germans are growing. Experts are calling for greater investment in things like education and infrastructure. There are clouds on the horizon, aren't there?
Oh, there certainly are. I think one of the things that Germany has done very well over the course of the last decade, and slightly longer actually, has been to engage in a process of domestic restructuring. But that has come at a cost of, as you said, widening income imbalances. Those at the bottom end of the scale are struggling to make ends meet, I guess. But nonetheless, the average standard of living in Germany is significantly better than it is in a number of other European countries. So we shouldn't perhaps be too critical. But certainly this problem of Germany trying to go for what the finance minister calls a black zero on public finances means that he's trying to balance the budget at the cost of investment. And there are certainly many German economists out there who believe that Germany is indeed underinvesting in infrastructure and education, and that the time is nigh for a loosening of the purse strings.
What about the digital economy? Germany is lagging behind there too. Its infrastructure is reliant upon the old-fashioned copper wire and not fibre. I mean, it's lagging behind countries like Latvia and Mexico even. To what extent is that going to impact future economic performance?
Well, I mean, if we don't see the investment, then clearly it will mean that Germany's economy is perhaps out of tune with what's happening in other parts of the world. But I certainly get the sense that this is a subject which is being taken very seriously by German companies. The digital economy, automation, the substitution of labour for robots in some industries is certainly very high on the agenda. It's something which many German companies are at the forefront of anyway. So I think we will, over time, see that Germany begins to make more progress in this area. It's not as if it's a total laggard, certainly when compared to some of its larger industrialised peers. Obviously, the likes of Latvia have invested very heavily in tech over the course of the past 20 years. Germany has had a slightly different economic base, so it has a long way to catch up. But I do think progress is being made there.
What about Germany's automotive industry, a previous powerhouse, an economic driver, embroiled as it is still in the emissions scandal at the Dieselgate? And of course, you've got competition now from electric vehicles being made elsewhere in the world. Is the industry going to remain as strong as it always has, or is it going to have to undergo seismic shifts?
The signs are that the likes of Volkswagen recognise the threat. They have made significant investments in this area, but obviously they lag behind some of the market leaders in the field. But of course, what the German automakers have is scale. So when they do get a product which finally works, they will be able to perhaps scale it up in a way that the likes of Tesla will struggle to do. So I think that Germany might be lagging behind at the moment, but it's not always the first mover in this game which wins the race. So I wouldn't write them off just yet.
Peter, it's been really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us today. Now, brace for impact. Europe's biggest budget airline, Ryanair, is in the middle of what CEO Michael O'Leary described as a significant management failure. So what's going on? The airline was forced to cancel 48 flights a day for the next 6 weeks after admitting that it messed up the planning of pilots' annual leave. At this week's AGM, O'Leary said that pilots would be told to take 3 weeks' leave now and have the other week in January. Ryanair also offered bonus payments to captains and first officers to forego leave. But now some pilots want to renegotiate their contracts with the Irish airline and are discussing the possibility of mass sick days. Thousands of passengers are unhappy. The airline says that more than half the passengers affected by the mass cancellations have been rebooked onto alternative Ryanair flights. Others were issued refunds. The airline is likely to face a bill of at least $25 million. A new study published by the World Health Organization says that people who fly regularly may be at risk of breathing contaminated air. UK-based airline EasyJet is trying out a new air filtering system but denies that that's because crew and passengers are at risk. Caroline Malone explains.
If you get on a plane, nearly any commercial flight, air vents allow you to breathe normally. The air pumped into the cabin includes bleed air. That's been sucked in by the engines, then compressed, and finally circulated with the existing air inside the aircraft. But sometimes that bleed air is contaminated with remnants of engine fuel or liquids. That's caused incidents on major airlines, including one in May when cabin crew became ill from the fumes. Well, a study published in the WHO's Public Health Journal says low-level leakage into the aircraft could be a problem, particularly for pilots and crew who fly regularly. A co-author of the report, a former pilot herself with a master's degree in airline safety, said more than 1 in 10 of the pilots she studied who flew the BAE 146 aircraft suffered chronic illnesses such as cancer, neurological problems, and some were fatal.
This problem is related to any aircraft using bleed air supplied off the engine, but that aircraft had a lot more problems, and the effects that they were getting were identical or consistent with what we would expect and what we've seen over and over again with exposure to these particular substances. This has been going on 5 decades, 6 decades in fact, and the symptoms they were complaining about then are the same ones now.
Well, EasyJet has just announced trials of a new air filtration system, but denies a connection to so-called aerotoxic syndrome. The airline says it wants to identify and reduce incidents of unusual smells and fumes in the cabin. These events can have short-term effects on health and lead to flight disruption. But it continues, this has no link with the study whether any form of long-term illness occurs in airline crew due to exposures to cabin air. Well, earlier this year, the European Aviation Safety Agency also said in-flight measurements have been conducted on a number of commercial flights after defining adequate and reliable air contaminants, measurements methods for cockpit and passenger cabin areas. The results show that cabin cockpit air quality is similar or better than what's observed in normal indoor environments. No occupational exposure limits and guidelines were exceeded. Well, despite the reassurances, other people in the airline industry, particularly those who've become ill, want more thorough research. Based on 2015 numbers, 500,000 airline crew could be exposed to the fume danger, and so could 3.5 billion passengers who fly every year.
Still to come on Counting the Cost, we'll take a look at how internet privacy is more protected in Europe than in the US. But first, the value of Norway's sovereign wealth fund has officially hit the $1 trillion milestone. The Rainy Day Fund was started 20 years ago to invest the country's oil revenue for future generations. It takes all the money that the state receives from oil and invests it in assets abroad. The mega fund owns on average 1.3% of every listed company globally. And Norway's politicians are likely to find it hard to resist the temptation to raid the world's biggest state piggy bank. The US central bank left borrowing costs on hold this week, but that wasn't the historic bit. The Fed confirmed that it would start unwinding its huge stimulus program, which it created to combat the financial crisis. It'll start cutting its $4.5 trillion balance sheet from next month. Fed Chair Janet Yellen said the process would be gradual, but the move does mark a major change in policy in the world's largest economy and the end of quantitative easing. China's borrowing costs could be going up slightly. That's because Standard & Poor's has cut China's credit rating, blaming rising debt levels. The rating's cut to A+ from AA-. It isn't a big move. However, the downgrade comes with just 4 weeks to go until the Chinese Communist Party's National Congress. China's finance ministry criticized the move, saying it was the wrong decision. Now, the professionals in charge of risk management, the global reinsurance industry, are still trying to assess the likely costs of this year's extreme Atlantic hurricane season. The fear among some risk assessors is that climate change means some assets may become uninsurable in the future. The risk is that extreme weather means claims will rise faster than expected and that premiums won't be adequate to cover the shortfall. In the insurance world, that's known as the protection gap. Hurricane Maria has left behind widespread damage. It hit Puerto Rico as a Category 4 storm, causing widespread flooding and tidal surges. Andy Gallagher reports now from the capital, San Juan.
Puerto Rico's southeast coast was the first to feel the effects of Hurricane Maria. But the entire country is now dealing with the aftermath of one of the most powerful storms to ever hit this island. With winds of 250 kilometers per hour, Puerto Rico was pounded for most of Wednesday. In San Juan, hurricane-force winds ripped off roofs and blew out windows. Power has now been lost across the entire island. Puerto Rico's ailing electricity grid is still recovering from Hurricane Irma. It could be months before it's restored.
The Puerto Rico and the San Juan that we knew yesterday is no longer there. So we have to reconstruct, rebuild, reinvent it. We have to be resilient, and we have to push on, if not with our bodies, with our hearts and with our soul.
Puerto Rico has long been spared from a direct hit, as hurricanes tend to veer either south or north of the island. The last direct hit from a Category 4 hurricane was decades ago. The nearby US Virgin Islands also took a direct hit, with many residents leaving before Maria arrived.
Trying to figure out where I was going to stay in Puerto Rico, and I think a lot of other people were in the same boat. I mean, you had everybody leaving from the BVI, people leaving from the USVI, but I'm glad to be in Miami now.
Widespread flooding is now a concern, as are mudslides in the island's mountainous regions. The governor of Puerto Rico has now put a curfew in place as a rescue and recovery operation is launched. With little communication, it's hard to assess the damage, but it may be this island's coastal communities and rural communities that took the worst of the damage. As Hurricane Maria leads a path of destruction across Puerto Rico, the recovery in this US territory, already dealing with so many challenges, could be a long one.
Joining us now from Zurich is Peter Zimmerman. Peter's an expert in storms and hurricanes and heads the Atmospheric Perils Department with Zurich-based reinsurance company Swiss Re. What a great name, Peter, for a department. You'd be the man to ask then, are weather-related catastrophes on the increase right now?
Thanks very much, first of all, for having me on the show. Yes, this is a question that we are confronted with very often right now. Are these storms on the increase? Now, for one particular event, it's always very difficult to say what is the contribution of any effects like global warming. But one thing that we have observed, there are three important components: sea surface temperatures, then the humidity that is in the atmosphere, and the sea levels. And all of these three components are very important, have played a big role in all these events that we've seen, are on the rise. That's at least what the predictions say, in a warmer world due to global warming.
OK, now as far as your industry is concerned, does climate change mean that some assets are now becoming uninsurable? How big is the protection gap that we're seeing right now?
I do not think that assets are becoming uninsurable due to that. I think there is enough capital available that can be utilized in order to protect these risks. So the reason for a protection gap lies in other areas, really.
Have insurance companies like yours been preparing? I mean, obviously, you must have been preparing, I'm guessing, for climate change, the impact of storms like the current Atlantic season we're seeing at the moment?
Yes, of course. Preparing is a very important part, right? And it's really at the core of the business that we are doing. So preparing means we need to have adequate capital. We need to have enough money to be prepared to pay out in case such events happen. That's very clear. In terms of very short-term preparations, right now, when these events are really unfolding, obviously we're in close contact with our clients and their brokers and try to reach out and see in what way we can support them.
Peter, given that climate change is happening, there's very little doubt now. Scientists tell us that climate is changing. How is your industry changing and adapting?
We have to clearly keep very much aware of what science tells us, how global warming will impact the frequency and also the intensity in particular of natural catastrophes. And all the big reinsurers really do have that on their priority list in order to be aware and anticipate changes that are going to happen. One thing to be aware of is that our industry operates very much on a yearly or maybe 2 or 3 year cycle where we renew our contract. So we do have the capability to react fairly quickly to changes that are happening.
Peter, it's been really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
The growth of the digital economy has exposed consumers to an unprecedented level of risk regarding personal privacy. It's an issue that's pitting the US against the European Union. And here's why. Our data is used to try to sell us stuff in the shape of personalised advertising. It's how internet companies make money. That is why so much of the internet is free to us users. We're the product and not the customer. And data is a billion-dollar industry. The most significant pro-privacy developments are made in Europe. Google and Facebook currently face more restrictions in Europe than in the US. The deal between the European Union and the US to protect EU citizens' data when it's transferred across the pond is called the Privacy Shield. The EU is currently reviewing whether it's working properly. And the EU is bringing in a new data protection law next year, the principle behind it being that every individual must provide permission for their personal data to be used. Companies like Google will have 2 years to comply. Well, Christina Irian is a senior researcher at the Institute for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam. And here's what she had to say on the way that the law works at the moment.
The European Union has a very advanced legal framework on data protection, and we also should consider that in today's world, where personal data is really the essence of almost all economic activity, that we need such protections to be robust and in place. And that in the European Union, data protection is a fundamental right, is an extremely modern approach and has, I think, is the right answer to the challenges of the future with personal data. I think that the law in itself is, of course, under strain. It's a thorny issue to try to protect personal data in practice. One of the issues is that personal data is not glued to one single place in the world, but it travels all around the world, almost at the speed of light, and the law cannot easily follow. This is also why the European Union has made a new law, the General Data Protection Regulation. This law will enter into force next year in May, and it tries something new. It tries to turn around the logic of the application of the law to where the data of the user comes from. So basically it shouldn't matter anymore if a provider is sitting in another country outside of the European Union. If this provider receives personal data from European Union citizens, then the laws should also come and apply in this context.
And finally this week, China's unveiled the world's fastest bullet train, the Fuxing. It'll travel at up to 350 kilometers an hour and shave some 30 minutes off the journey time from Beijing to Shanghai. But there are concerns about the cost of China's high-speed rail ambitions, as Adrian Brown reports.
China's high-speed railways are a potent symbol of its economy. Today the network has more than 20,000 kilometres of track, the largest in the world. And it's all happened in less than a decade. The link between Beijing and Shanghai is one of the busiest. Experts say the new service is about more than just the lure of speed.
The purpose of raising the speed is mainly symbolic. The train can run at a speed of 350 kilometers an hour, the fastest in the world. This implies the strength of Chinese train technology and science.
But high-speed trains are expensive to operate. One international think tank estimates that it costs 90% more to build lines for trains that reach 350 kilometers an hour than for ones that allow a speed of 250. But China's government is in a hurry to build more, both in China and abroad.
Nobody predicted that the high-speed rail between Beijing and Shanghai would be profitable when it was built, but after 7-8 year development it gains. So it can work in the West regions as well after 8-10 years.
Just 6 years ago, there were questions over the future of the network after a high-speed rail crash caused by a signalling failure killed 40 people. Yet today, train travel offers what flying in China simply doesn't: reliability. In recent years, flying in China has become characterized by lengthy delays and cancellations. In 2016, a third of all flights failed to leave on time. It's been a year for trumpeting China's technological achievements. In May, the country's first domestically manufactured wide-body jet made its maiden flight. A few weeks before that, its homemade aircraft carrier slipped into the sea for the first time. And now, once more, China holds the title for the world's fastest passenger train.
And that is our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, then follow and tweet me. I'm at @afinnegan on Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or you could drop us a line. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan. From the whole team here in Doha, thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.